Hi everyone, my name is Duncan Epping and I'm a Chief Technologist working for VMware in the Cloud Infrastructure Business Group. And today I've got something very special for you. Normally I would be talking about topics like vSAN or virtual volumes or Site Recovery Manager or our DR services, but today I'm actually talking about career development and personal growth. And in particular, I'm going to be talking about 6 fundamental concepts that can help you advance your career. Now, besides being a chief technologist, I'm also a blogger. I blog at yellowbricks.com. I'm an author. I wrote multiple books, some of which you may know, which are the vSAN deep dive or maybe the clustering deep dive. And on top of that, I'm also a podcaster. I actually host a podcast called Unexplored Territory. Now, one of the things that I do want to mention before we actually get into the meat of this particular presentation is that although you may follow the same steps, it doesn't necessarily mean you will get the same results. And I think this particular quote, "You are only entitled to the action and never to its fruits," actually embodies that, because I think it's one of those things that a lot of people tend to forget. They see a particular path that someone took, they see some of the concepts that someone has applied, and they assume that if they apply the same concepts, that the results will be the same. But that is not necessarily the case. So that is something that I do want to stress. Some of the hints and tips that I may be giving may have a different impact at the point in time when or where you apply those particular tips and hints. So that is definitely something to take into consideration. Now, one of the things, of course, that people always tend to discuss when it comes to climbing a corporate ladder is that it's extremely important where you are coming from. And in my opinion, it doesn't necessarily matter where you're coming from, but it probably matters most where you are going. Of course, if you look at it from my perspective, I work for VMware, which is a large corporation, as most of you know, close to 40,000 people, headquartered in Palo Alto. But I don't live in Palo Alto. I actually live in the Netherlands. And to be very specific, I was actually born in Holland, which in this particular case even was South Holland. I was born in a tiny place called Bodegraven, and some of you who actually drink a lot of beer may recognize this particular picture, which is what we call the Molen, Brewery de Molen, which of course is Dutch for windmill. Now, I was born in this particular city. It has about 18,000 people, and it probably is, I don't know, 4 or 5,000 miles away from Palo Alto. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's not possible to climb the corporate ladder. And the way I actually done that is something that I'll be discussing in the upcoming 40, 45 minutes or so. Now, one of the interesting things, and I've already just mentioned this, is that I actually live in the Netherlands and I was born in Holland. So for those who don't know, those two are actually different things. So the Netherlands is the country itself, and if you look at Holland, South and North Holland, those are actually two provinces which are part of the Netherlands. So if there's nothing else that will learn today during that presentation, hopefully this is something that you've picked up from this particular presentation. Now, when we look at all of the different things and how things started for me, I think I started probably in a very similar way that most of you started, at least those who are the same age of me, because some of you may be 20, 30 years old, you may not have started with the same type of machines. But back in the days when I actually started in IT, and I probably shouldn't say in IT because this is what I was using at home when I actually got my first computer. My dad actually ended up buying my first computer because I was constantly nagging about it. I wanted to have this machine that I could play games on, and he actually ended up buying me the MSX1 from Canon. Later on, that machine actually got replaced with an MSX2 from Philips, and on top of that, of course, I also had to own a Commodore 64 at some point in time. You can imagine that those were the types of machines that people got excited about because it allowed you to start playing games. Now, the interesting things with these kind of machines back in the day wasn't the fact that you could play games, but the most interesting aspect of these types of machines was the amount of effort that it would involve to actually play a game. The majority of you now probably have a phone or an iPad or a MacBook or a laptop, and when you want to play a game, most of those types of games typically are installed by one click. So you go to the App Store, you download the game, and you play the game. But that's not how things worked in the past. The very first game that I actually ended up playing was a game that I had to write myself based on some of the information they could find in magazines. So some of the magazines had literally multiple pages of code. You had to retype the code in your computer so you could actually end up starting or uh, 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 start playing that particular game. So that is actually what got me started. And that's probably where I learned the most as well in the early days by just simply trying to get something working, debugging it, try it again, debugging it again, try it again, etc., etc. So there was this whole effort involved. Of course, over time, I moved into the x86 space like the majority view, and one of the first machines I actually bought probably looked something similar like this, was a tower model. It had that famous turbo button, which probably didn't do a lot, and of course I ended up playing games as well. Something like Lemmings and other games were probably my favorite back in the days. Again, here, one of those classics problems that the majority of people had was how to get some of those games loaded. And of course, on top of that, sharing games was one of those things which a lot of people were actually into back in those days. Now, when you would share games back in those days, one of the ways you would go about doing that was setting up what we called a bulletin board system. And the bulletin board system, for those who haven't been around for as long as some of the others, basically was a direct connection to your computer via a modem. So that modem was connected to your phone line. Someone would dial into your computer itself. You would see a menu that looked probably something similar to this, and then within that menu you could have multiple folders or directories, and then you could traverse that tree, and you could go to the place where you wanted to be and actually download, for instance, a game. Now, back in the days, that could take potentially hours, maybe even days, depending, of course, on the size of what you needed to download and the speed of the modem that you had, or potentially the phone line or a connection that you had back in the days as well. So there was an extreme amount of effort involved in actually getting a single game up and running. But of course, one of those things that I think was important to me was actually trying to figure out how it worked, and then, of course, sharing some of my learnings and some of the things that I've developed and some of the things that I may have received from others as well, again, through that particular BBS platform. Now, one of the other things that I've done early in my career, probably I was around the age of 19 or 20, and I worked at Oracle back in the day, is that I actually started my own, as we called it back in the day, e-zine, which is basically an electronic magazine. And that electronic magazine, one of the focuses that we had was hardcore punk music. And there were a lot of people in the Netherlands and in Europe actually that came together on this particular message board on this e-zine where we were doing things like reviews, interviews, etc. But the key thing here for us was basically sharing some of the things that we've learned through this particular platform. And then, of course, later on, that for me actually evolved into my own blog. So I started that in 2007. And remember the date because I think that is something that is extremely important because it will show you how fast things can change in your life. So in 2007, I actually wrote my first article on yellow bricks. It did not look like this, but I have a screenshot later on that will show you more or less what it looked like back in the day. And that first article was very straightforward. It was about ghosted devices and how you could remove those ghosted devices from your Windows image potentially. But that's basically how I got started. So I started out with the MS6, moved over to x86 platforms, hosted my own BBS, and then actually started sharing some of the things that I was passionate about through electronic magazines and later on through a blog. Now, that brings me to my first learning of today because I think this is something that is extremely crucial. And I also think that most of you are probably aware that this is extremely crucial, but not everyone may be doing this. Now, I'm not saying that every single person should be starting a blog. I'm not saying that every single person should be on Twitter, but I do feel that sharing is caring. I think it's extremely important to share with other people what you've learned. That doesn't necessarily need to be through a blog. That could be locally within your company as well, right? If you find out that the way you need to install something, the way you need to configure something is through this particular path, I feel it's extremely important to share internally how something works. That also applies to externally, and that is of course where something like blogging or Twitter or maybe a podcast or something like YouTube can come into play. On top of that, one of the other things, of course, what I feel is extremely important is not just sharing your knowledge, but it's also sharing your feedback. Now, this can be somewhat difficult, and especially if you're someone from the Netherlands like myself, because we can be extremely direct. When you provide feedback, think about the cultural aspect. One of the things in the Netherlands which people tend to do is when something sucks or when they feel something doesn't work, they will tell you directly that it sucks or that it doesn't work. Now, that is one of the things that I've learned probably the most over the last years is that calling a baby ugly is not something that everyone will appreciate. And that is something that I actually have focused on tremendously over the last, probably I should say 5 to 8 years, because what I've noticed in the past is when I was giving feedback is because of the way that I was providing the feedback, it wasn't always taken on board. So the cultural aspect here is extremely important. So in this particular case, it does matter where you're from, and that's something that you actually need to take into consideration on top of that. Now, how I got started in IT is pretty straightforward. It's probably very similar for the most of you, maybe even 99% of you. The way I actually got started was first of all, of course, I ended up on a help desk, picking up the phone and doing these first level, low level uh, uh, troubleshooting. So things like, my printer doesn't work. Okay, is the cable connected? Oh, my app doesn't work. Have you restarted your laptop? Those basic types of things. And then I actually evolved into an administrator, and I started focusing on the desktop. And of course, when you focus on the desktop, one of the first things that you'll end up doing is probably imaging machines. At least that is something that you would be doing in the past. Of course, today that doesn't really apply anymore with all of the new technologies that have been introduced. But my life was mainly focused around uh, actually imaging laptops in this particular case. And one of the first projects that I actually had, or the second project that I had, was at Oracle. And one of the things that I had to do there was I had to roll out 1,500 or 1,400 new laptops. And this is basically what the screen that I saw for probably 8 hours a day. And that's how I got started within IT. Now, when I worked for Oracle, and this was a particular project, they hired me through this third party company. And they actually not just hired me, they actually hired three other people, and we were a team of four. And what we were doing was constantly imaging those laptops. So they had to roll out, 14, 1,500 new laptops as fast as possible. And one of the things that probably stood out the most is after that particular project was completed, at the end of the project, they wanted to keep or retain one person from that team of four. Now, to be honest, I probably wasn't the most technical person in that team. I wasn't the most skilled person in the team, but they actually did end up hiring me as a system administrator, being responsible for the whole Windows estate within Oracle itself. So back in the days, of course, when you had to install Windows NT, now actually showing a CD-ROM here, but from what I recall, the very first time I actually installed it, I was actually using floppy disks. So you had to use, I don't know, 30, 40 floppies to get this up and running. But that was the second thing that I was responsible for in my career. I ended up joining Oracle first as a contractor, and then uh, later on they hired me as a full-time employee. So I became responsible for Windows NT at that point in time. Now, after a while, I ended up deciding that I wanted to leave Oracle and wanted to focus on something new. I joined another company which actually went bankrupt pretty much within 6 months of me joining, and as a result, I had to go look for a new job. And I actually ended up uh, finding a role as a consultant, being responsible for Lotus Domino and Lotus Notes deployments. Now, for those who worked with this particular type of solution, I can assure you that it was rather painful. But on the other hand, I needed to have a job, I needed to make money, and I had a family that I was responsible for at that point in time as well. So I needed to make sure that we had some source of income. So for me, that probably was one of the best solutions at the time. Now, after a while, I did realize that this wasn't something that made me extremely happy, and I ended up finding a new role at a company where they were actually looking for someone that could help them manage their data center, but actually evolve that data center from legacy to what, at least at that point in time, was relatively new, which was virtualization. And I actually ended up introducing virtualization at this particular company, and we installed probably, I don't know, 10 to 20 hosts somewhere in that space. I think we started out with 8 and it ended up being 16, 17 hosts or something like that, probably 2 blade enclosures full. And back in the day, of course, that was ESX server 251, I believe, that I installed for the very first time. But before that, I actually was, or I had played around with VMware before, which was basically VMware Workstation back in the day, probably the very first version when I worked for Oracle. But that is something that I didn't realize until I started working with vSphere or ESX again. Now, if you look at that career path itself, I think one of the things actually stood out. Now, I've already mentioned I got hired as a, you know, desktop imaging monkey, I should probably say. I was constantly imaging all of those laptops. And one of the reasons Oracle actually ended up hiring me again as that system administrator wasn't because of the skills that I had, wasn't because I was the most technical of that team of 4 people, but it was because I was the only person within that particular team that was communicating with my management. And what I was doing at the time is every single day, at the end of the day, I would walk over to the person that was actually managing that particular project. I would walk over to him and explain to him, okay, this is what we've done today. This is how many laptops we managed to image. These are some of the problems that we faced, and this is how we actually solved those problems. And that was one of the key reasons that they actually ended up hiring me back in the day at Oracle, because I was the only person in the team that actually ended up communicating with the other folks within that organization. Now, that may sound like that is something that you would normally do. It may sound logical, but back in the day when we were actually doing that particular project, we weren't sitting next to the rest of the IT team. We actually had our own building that we were or actually was a storage facility that we were located in, which was about 200 or 300 meters away from the other building. So you wouldn't normally typically see the other folks that you would be working with. But I actually made an effort to go out and have that conversation with them to explain what it is, what we were doing, what kind of challenges we were facing. And also, I was capable of setting expectations and managing those expectations as well. I would be explaining this is what we've done today and this is what I expect to be doing tomorrow if all goes well. Now, also, again, when it comes to communications, one of those things that I've already mentioned is that it is not always easy depending on the culture. The cultural aspect from a communication perspective can, of course, be a challenge. Of course, can be a challenge when you're Dutch and you're used to being blunt and extremely direct, but it could also be the other way around. There are, of course, also many other cultures where it's very frowned upon to be very direct, and in some cases, you may need to be very direct. So, in this particular case, I think one of the key learnings, of course, is that communication is probably one of the most important things when it comes to advancing your career. Now, when I was at that particular stage in my career, I tried to figure out where I wanted to go towards. I was already working for a consultancy company, and for that consultancy company, I was a consultant focused on virtualization. I wanted to take that next step in my career. And that's actually when I started blogging. And this is probably one of the first templates that I used for Yellow Bricks. I think there was one before that, but I couldn't find a screenshot of it. And as I mentioned already, I started out at the end of 2007, and then I just started writing in 2008. And this screenshot is actually from 2009. Now, one of the things that probably stands out here is that this particular article about EMC PowerPath I wrote in 2009. But if you look at the right side of this particular screen, you can see that I wrote almost close to 800 blog articles, probably in the course of, I don't know, year and a half, something like that, year and 8 months, 10 months, whatever it was exactly. But it actually shows how passionate I was about sharing that knowledge, and that actually helped me evolve my career extremely fast. And the way I actually went about doing that is, I think when you want to go somewhere, it's extremely important to set goals. But one of the things that people tend to do is when they set a goal, they tend to look at it as at it from what is the ultimate thing that I want to reach? So what is that big, hairy, audacious goal? And that is something that I've never done. One of the things that I've always done is that I wanted to set an outcome goal and I wanted to set a progress goal. Things like, for instance, the frequency, the duration, the quality, those types of things are more important to me than the actual outcome. My outcome when I wanted to start, for instance, blogging, was never to become the best blogger. I just simply wanted to share as much information as I potentially could. And on top of that, I wanted to learn as much as I could. So those were that was particular my outcome goal. I just wanted to learn as much as I could about virtualization. Now, when it came to the process goals, one of the things that I set as a process for myself along this whole process of advancing my career was reading a single white paper per week. But if I didn't understand the content of the white paper, I would actually read it multiple times. And this is something that I've done in a couple of cases. For instance, there was this famous white paper about transparent page sharing. There was one about DRS, Distributed Resource Scheduler, and I probably ended up reading it 4, 5, 6, maybe even 7 times before I fully understood all of the different aspects of it. Now, on top of that, what I also forced myself to do is when I would read or learn about something, is that I would also share what I've learned about that particular topic. So that's where the blogging came into play. And that's where, on top of that, also answering questions on VMTN came into play, the VMware community forums. And this is something that I still do today. Every single week, I probably spend at least 2 to 3 hours per week answering questions on VMTN. And why do I do this? Well, personally, I tend to do this because I feel for me that's extremely important to figure out what kind of challenges customers are facing. Of course, I can figure that out by having conversations with customers at events like these, for instance, or other VMUGs or other industry events like VMware Explore. But on top of that, if I look at VMTN, other problems may pop up of different types of customers. When I go to events or when I visit customers itself, they tend to be the larger customers with which I have conversations. But of course, I also want to figure out what kind of challenges other people are facing, people that may only have, let's say, 4 hosts or maybe even just 10 VMs on 1 or 2 hosts. That is something that is extremely important. But that's basically what got me started when it came to blogging. I wanted to share my knowledge and I wanted to learn as much as I could about virtualization itself. And then, of course, I had these process goals along the way. Now, when I talk to people about this particular concept, it is something that does come up fairly regularly, is the amount of effort that actually goes into it. And this is something that I tend to stress to people. When people talk about a particular career path or a particular career goal, they will tell you, I want to become a CTO, or I want to become a chief technologist, or I want to become a tech marketing architect, or I want to become a principal consultant, or whatever it ends up being doesn't really matter. One of the things that people typically don't tend to focus on is how you actually get there, the path, that process of getting there. And I think that's probably one of the most challenging aspects. And that's where this quote actually refers to, because I think a lot of people actually want to be, but they don't necessarily want to become. So what does that actually mean? Well, if you want to get somewhere, there are certain steps that you need to take. Without those particular steps, it's going to be almost impossible to actually reach that particular goal. And what I've noticed over the last couple of years, when people tend to talk about wanting to reach a particular goal, so when they talk about, for instance, I want to become a principal or I want to become a chief technologist, whatever it ends up being, and you lay out the path and you lay out what you've done, they say, well, of course, I've got a family, I've got 2 kids, I've got a wife, I've got hobbies. It's going to be very difficult to actually invest that amount of time within this particular time frame. Well, unfortunately, that is life. That's part of this whole process. You need to be able to invest time to actually be able to reach that particular level. And on top of that, if you're going to invest that time, make sure that you set realistic goals and realistic expectations at home as well in terms of the amount of time that you're going to spend. And I think this is something that also a lot of people tend to forget when it comes to setting their goals and setting expectations. Yes, it's easy to set goals, but first of all, are they realistic? And then secondly, when you set those goals, make sure that you actually discuss those goals with your partner as well. If you have a spouse at home, if you have kids, make sure that they also understand that there's a reason you're doing this, that you're trying to achieve something. That doesn't only apply, for instance, to your career development, but that also applies to personal growth. Hell, it could even apply to something like, your sports. If you enjoy running and you want to run a half marathon, but you're only at 5K, of course, there's an X amount of effort that needs to go into it before you get there. Same applies to cycling, swimming, football, whatever it ends up being. On top of that, one of the other things which I think is extremely important is trying to get a better understanding of what you're good at and more importantly, what you're not good at, and actually self-evaluate, reflect, and try to identify your strengths and your weaknesses and plan accordingly. For instance, I had a couple of weaknesses that I identified fairly early on in my career. One of those things, for instance, was public speaking. So I had to make sure that I would address that. And that was actually part of my path towards reaching that particular goal. So make sure that you reflect to be able to get where you want to go. Of course, there's also this particular aspect of being at the right place at the right time when it comes to career advancement and career development. Now, there's a reason these things happen, but as you can see, I started blogging in 2007, and early 2008, EMC, in this particular case, Chad Sackett, reached out to me and asked me if I was interested in being one of the first V specialists back in the day for EMC. And this was a practice, a VMware-based practice at EMC, um, that would help customers on their journey towards virtualization. That was 2008, and I started blogging in 2007. Why did Chet reach out to me? Well, fairly simple. He actually found me through my blog. I wrote a whole bunch of articles at that point in time, probably already 100, maybe 150 articles. And one of the issues that he had in his lab, he was able to solve through one of the articles that I wrote. So that is one of the reasons that I actually ended up on his radar. I didn't only end up on Chet's radar, at EMC's radar, but I also ended up on VMware's radar. And in the same month, VMware also happened to reach out to me, and I actually ended up taking that career opportunity, and it ended up working for VMware. Now, for those who don't know, I started out working for VMware as a senior consultant in PSO. So I actually was a consultant, and I worked with some of the larger customers within Europe, creating their designs or doing health checks, etc. In 2008 is where I started as a senior consultant, and then in 2010 I actually was promoted or took on a new job role, I should probably say, as a principal architect within the cloud practice. And the cloud practice back in the day was there was the team that was actually doing the first deployment of VMware vCloud Director. And then in 2011, a new opportunity popped up, and I actually ended up becoming a principal technical marketing architect. And then after technical marketing, I actually moved into product development, and I joined the Evo Rail team, or I actually started the Evo Rail team as a principal architect. And then a couple of years later, I actually ended up joining the storage and availability business unit as a chief technologist for storage, which eventually over time emerged or merged with a couple of other business units, and it ended up being the cloud infrastructure business unit, where I'm still doing the same job role today. Now, there are a couple of interesting inflection points when it comes to my career, because it seems like a natural progression, but there were a couple of things that happened in order for me to be able to go to that next step. For instance, when I joined as a senior consultant, one of the things I actually ended up doing is I ended up doing my VCDX exam. So I went through all of the written exams, and then I did my verbal exam as well. I actually ended up becoming a VCDX 007, one of the first VCDXs, or I probably should say the first VCDX in Europe from the top of my head, but also one of the first VCDXs, of course, globally. As a result, I ended up on stage, and I got this award for becoming one of the first VCDXs alongside 10 other folks. And when I ended up on stage there, I actually ended up meeting the person that was about to start that cloud practice. So that is one of the reasons I actually ended up joining the cloud practice. If I wouldn't have done that VCDX exam, I would have not ended up within that cloud practice team. The other thing that also happened is that at the same time, during that same event, when I was up on the stage, someone said, hey, you know what? You should probably meet so and so. And I actually ended up meeting the person that at the time was responsible for technical marketing within VMware. And that's how I got on that person's radar as well. Now, that's not necessarily how I got hired. How I got hired within technical marketing was because I ended up presenting at VMworld in 2010. The person that was responsible for technical marketing saw that filled up room. He saw my presentation, and he asked me if I wanted to join that team. So that is one of the reasons I ended up being hired as a technical marketing architect. Now, funnily enough, that person actually a couple of years later started the Evo Rail team, and I actually helped him with that. So that is one of the reasons I made that jump. Now, of course, when we talk about Evo Rail, it's one of those projects that wasn't successful within VMware. But on the other hand, it was successful for Dell. So there was still this aspect of success when it comes to that particular project. Now, of course, vSAN was part of that project. So for me, from a natural evolution perspective, it actually makes sense to move over to the storage and availability team at some point in time and focus on vSAN from here on out. Now, I think that probably shows you how some of these things uh, align and how you can actually go from one role to the other role by doing certain things at a certain point in time. So it's not just that I got asked to fulfill or to jump into a particular position. There was a particular reason I got asked to become part of that team. Now, in order to get there, there are a couple of things, of course, that you may need to do. And one of those things is probably try to get out of your comfort zone. And that is something that I've done probably fairly well, maybe even to a very extreme level. The way I actually went about doing that for the very first time is when I presented at VMworld. Now, for those who don't know, I've already mentioned that one of the things that I identified as a weakness in the early days of my career was public speaking. It wasn't communication per se. It was, communication was probably decent, but public speaking is something that I was terrified of. So one of the things that I ended up doing, because I felt that one of those skills that I needed to improve, was accepting a speaking slot at VMworld. Now, of course, I just didn't jump into the deep end here. Well, actually, I ended up jumping into the deep end, but the way that actually happened was one of the HA engineers submitted a session and he reached out to me if I wanted to help him develop some of his content because he didn't really know what customers were looking for, and I probably knew some of the best practices and some of the things that customers were doing from a do's and don'ts perspective, and he wanted to share that knowledge as well. So I ended up helping him with the development of all of that material, and then after we created that slide deck, he said, you know what, you've created half of the slide deck, why don't you help me present this particular deck at VMworld? I said, well, I'm terrified of public speaking, so you know what, I'm not interested. He said, you know what, think about it for a couple of weeks. Let me know. We can always make a request out to the VMware team to see if you can be added to the session at a later date. So a couple of weeks went by, and I said, you know what, I probably should be doing it. But how many people will be showing up at the session? He said, well, normally when we do the session, about 50, 60 people show up because we just had a change in architecture. It probably will be around 100, 120, maybe 150 people at most, but I don't even expect that. Hopefully, it's going to be around 100 people. Well, at that point in time, I've never presented for more than 50 people. Actually, the most was probably 10 or 15 people, and that would get me extremely terrified. So what ended up happening is I was ready to go to VMworld, and I was ready to go there with the developer and present VMware HA with the developer. But a couple of weeks before the event, he pings me and he says, you know what, I can't make it. I have a large number of bugs. We have this release that needs to get out at VMworld. It's going to be announced, so we need to make sure that it gets out. But there's still a significant number of bugs, and I really need to fix this. I can't go. I really need to fix this. So you need to do this on your own. I said, I need to do this on my own. It's going to be 100 people. It's going to be maybe 120 people. So I already started freaking out and I started to get nervous. Now, he reached out to the VMware team and he actually managed to get the VMware team to place the session on my name. So at that point in time, I log into the Speaker Resource Center and I look at the number of people registered, and it didn't say 100, it didn't say 150. It actually up being it ended up being 500 or 600 people that were registered, and that's not where it stopped because the closer we got to the event, the higher those numbers went. And the first session actually was fully packed with more than 700 people, and on top of that, they had a second session scheduled as well. And this is more or less what my room looked like the very first time I presented. Now, this is not me, well, it's actually me up on stage, but not at that particular session. This is a couple of years later when I was presenting a keynote with one of our executives, a business unit keynote, but it's more or less what it looked like. And you can imagine that it's terrifying when you end up on stage. So that is one of the reasons I always tell people to present on the VMUG first. And this is something that I still really enjoy, not just those larger user conferences, but probably even more so those smaller community events, those local events. Just last week or a couple of weeks ago, I was in Poland and I presented in front of maybe 50 or 70 people. I'm not sure how many were. A couple of months before that, I was actually in Ireland. There were about 100 people. And that is something that I really enjoy doing. Why? Well, the discussions that you get to have during the session, but also after the session, are extremely valuable. On top of that, when you go through your slide deck and there's a limited set of people in front of you, it makes you feel more comfortable. You get a bit more relaxed and you will be able to get your points across more and more often. So that is something that I focused on after that particular terrifying VMworld session, which probably wasn't the best session I've ever did. But after that, even though I never wanted to go back up on a stage, I ended up presenting probably dozens, if not hundreds of sessions at various VMUGs throughout Europe just to get better at what I wanted to be better at. Now, when people talk about public speaking, I think this quote is very striking because, in my opinion, it is extremely right. There are only two types of public speakers, those that are nervous and those that are liars. Now, of course, there are people that don't get nervous anymore, but I can assure you that most of the people that are up on stage will be nervous before they go up on stage. If you look at something like Explore and you see William Lamb actually doing the keynote, I can guarantee you that he was nervous when he went up there for the very first time. When you see someone that comes across as a natural when he's up there, someone like Chet Sackett or maybe Joe Bagley, I can assure you that they were nervous at some point in time, or probably are still nervous when they go up. So this is something that is natural for everyone. You just need to get familiar with that particular feeling. Now, when you get familiar with that particular feeling, I think it's extremely important to invest a lot of time of it, especially when it comes to public speaking. It's going to take an extreme amount of time or an extreme amount of repetition before you are familiar with that feeling. That doesn't necessarily mean that you need to do 1,000 dry runs at home, but it does mean, from my perspective, that you don't want to do that session just once at home and once at the VMUG. You probably want to do it 4 or 5 times at home and maybe try to present it at 5 or 6 different VMUGs. Practice at this particular case will make perfect, and it will be extremely uncomfortable for the first couple of times. So make sure that you take a crawl, walk, run approach. Start as small as possible, maybe even within your local company in front of 5 people, then do a local VMUG event in front of 20, 30, 40 people, and then maybe potentially consider VMware Explore or maybe a VMUG user con. That is the way that I went about doing this. Now, when you look at that Venn diagram that I just showed and was talking about getting uncomfortable, and when people talk about that comfort zone and that panic zone and that sweet spot that sits in between, which they typically refer to as a learning zone, I personally don't feel that it actually looks like this. When I look at this, I actually look at it as a circle. The way that I actually look at it is that when you're in that particular comfort zone and you want to learn something new, you lack confidence, and you try to find excuses why you shouldn't be doing it. Then when you start moving into that learning zone, that's where you start challenging yourself, you start learning new skills, and then when you've confident, that's when you've not only grown, but that's also when you start to get comfortable as well. So it is this circle and it's this constant motion of you actually feeling comfortable, feeling panicky, learning new technology, learning new concepts, learning new skills, then have that feeling of achievement. You've met your objectives, you reached your goals, but as soon as you've done that, you probably start feeling comfortable again and you need to move on through that circle again. So it's a constant evolution, in my opinion. And this is something that I would urge every single person to think about on a day to day basis. What am I doing? What do I feel comfortable with? And what are some of the things that I can change? What are some of the things that can enhance? And how can I challenge myself to actually start growing towards that goal that I may have set? Now, that also means that you need to find your passion for certain things and don't be afraid to be different as it may lead to unexpected results. And one of the things that I did in the early days of my career together with Frank Denneman is that we actually ended up writing a book. Back in the days, there weren't too many technical deep dive books and we didn't expect a lot from writing a book. When we were having the first discussions about writing this particular book, talking about HA and DRS specifically, we said, it would be really cool if we would be able to sell 100 copies, maybe even 500, right? That was probably our aim. If we could be able to sell 500 copies of this book, that would be amazing. Now, this particular book sold over 20,000 copies, and if you look at all of the different versions that we've done combined, it's probably close to 80 or 90,000 copies. So it far exceeded our expectations. Not only did it exceed our expectations in terms of the number of sales that are actually done, but it also provided us the opportunity to meet up with a lot of cool people. For instance, when we just released the 5.1 book, we were actually capable of meeting up with Steve Harrod and present the book to him. Not now, at the same event, slightly at a later time, we met up with Carl Eschenbach and also gave him a copy of the book. And then when I wrote the vSAN book, I actually ended up doing the same thing with Cormac Hogan, and we ended up meeting up with Pat Gelsinger. And of course, we took the time to take a picture with all of these folks as well and share the picture on social media because, in my opinion, everyone that is trying to achieve something needs to do some type of marketing. And I think this is probably one of those big marketing efforts that is part of that whole exercise. Now, there is a learning here as well, because I think networking, when it comes to these types of things, is extremely important. One of the reasons, of course, we wanted to have our picture taken with Carl Eschenbach. We wanted to sit down with Steve Harrod. We wanted to try to meet up with Pat Gelsinger was because we wanted to expand our network. We wanted to make sure that if new opportunities would pop up and one of those people were involved in making decisions, that they at least knew our names. And I think this is something that is extremely important and something that a lot of people tend to skip. They feel like, you know what, I'm not the kind of person that's trying to sell myself or trying to market myself. But if you're looking for opportunities, opportunities are just going to pop up on your radar. Opportunities are not handed to you. You need to make sure you find those opportunities and you grab those opportunities and you try to make the most out of it. I think that is where networking comes into play. And one of the things that people tend to forget when it comes to networking is that it takes a lot of time to actually grow an extremely large network. Within VMware, for instance, one of the things that I've probably spent the most amount of time on is trying to meet new people, trying to figure out what it is that they do, and then connect them with other people so that some kind of synergy forms. Not only is it useful for me to try to understand what it is that people do, how I can help them, and how they can potentially help me with solving particular problems? But it's also extremely useful for them to get to know other people as well and hopefully be able to solve some of the problems that they are facing simply by the power of their network. Now, the other thing which I think is extremely important when it comes to your work is quality. And this is one of the things that I focused on as well in the early days. Of course, I wrote an insane amount of articles, but I always wanted to make sure that there was something in there for every single person reading it. So that could be a simple article explaining something about ghosted devices, but back in the day, that was a serious problem that people were facing. Now, of course, the majority of you wouldn't be facing those challenges anymore. But back in the day, there was a problem that people were facing. So I wanted to make sure that when I was writing material, when I was doing my job, that quality always came first. Now, the other thing that I always asked myself is what is important to the business, what is important to the customers, and what is important to me. Some of the things that I would be writing about may be most important for the business, something like the BU that I work for today. It would be extremely important for me to write about vSAN Express Storage Architecture, which is the new Express storage architecture we introduced almost a year ago. But for you, it may be more important that I would write about the fact that VMware Converter isn't available anymore, and I would provide you with a new link. So what you would be seeing from a statistic perspective, for instance, from a blog, from social media, from a YouTube point of view, doesn't necessarily have to align with the company itself. Of course, you need to find that sweet spot. A, you need to figure out what it is that company wants me to do, and then of course, B, what it is that people would be interested in reading and what actually makes them come back to my blog, to my Twitter account, to my YouTube page, to my Instagram account, etc. Now, one of those things which I think on top of that is extremely important is longevity. The reason for it is that some of these things just take time. For instance, building a network, growing a network just takes a significant amount of time. Getting to know people, trying to understand what it is that they are doing, what they can benefit from, and how you can connect those people, which is where the amplification comes into play, is also extremely important. Last but not least, of course, when you go through this path, when you actually try to connect people, try to provide feedback, try to communicate, make sure that you are real, be you are, because I also think that that is probably one of those most important aspects when it comes to networking is that people actually get to meet the person that you're actually that you actually are. Now, before I actually wrap it up, one of the things that I do want to point out that this path isn't just uncommon. There are a lot of people that actually followed the same path. If you look at all of these different folks, and they're not actually doing the same thing. So if you look at someone like William Lamb, or on the right side, Kelsey Hightower, or maybe even Joe Bagley, Cormac Hogan, or Frank Denneman, they do have a couple of things in common, besides, of course, being extremely handsome. One of those things that they do have in common is that they've invested an insane amount of time in their career. They are constantly sharing what they have learned. That is probably what they're best at communicating. But on top of that, they also reflect back to try to understand in which direction the industry is heading and they've been doing it for an extremely long time. And I think that is something that we all have in common. That is something that we all should be focusing on. And with that, we've reached the end of my session. Hopefully, you've enjoyed it. Again, if you're interested in learning more about technology from a deep perspective, I would highly encourage you to subscribe to our podcast called the Unexplored Territory Podcast. If you want to connect with me, you can find me on Twitter on Duncan YB and of course on LinkedIn. Feel free to connect to me. Hopefully you enjoyed this session and I hope to see you next time at a live event.